When my father suddenly passed away from an unexpected illness, it left our family in a difficult situation. Along with the grief of losing him, we discovered he had accumulated a $5 million debt. My mother and my brother, Jack, quickly decided how to deal with my father's inheritance, but they didn't bother to consult me about it. They made all the decisions on their own, leaving me with the heavy burden of the debt. This made me very frustrated and angry. However, part of me couldn't help but smirk inside, thinking about the struggles they might face in the future because of their selfish choices. I'm 25 years old, single, and work as a nursery teacher at a daycare. After graduating from a junior college, I've always lived at home with my family, my father, mother, and Jack, who is close to my age. Growing up, Jack and I never got along very well. He went to a prestigious university, and he always looked down on me for attending a junior college. His arrogance was clear, and he often made fun of me for being what he considered average. He would say hurtful things like, "With your plain looks and lack of impressive qualifications, who would want to date you?" The truth is, I do have a boyfriend, but I've kept it a secret to avoid Jack's constant sarcasm and judgment. There was a time when his insults would sting, but that time has passed. Now, I feel proud of my work as a nursery teacher. I love working with children, helping them learn and grow every day. I find great joy in my job, and Jack's words no longer bother me the way they used to. My mother, on the other hand, seems to adore Jack. She is always praising him to relatives and neighbors because of his prestigious education. I often felt like an afterthought in her eyes, while Jack received all her attention and care. This favoritism was hard to deal with, but my father was different. He was always on my side. Whenever my mother would give Jack special treatment, like snacks, my father would secretly give me the same treats to make sure I didn't feel left out. He supported my decision to become a nursery teacher and would tell me how proud he was of me. His support meant the world to me. My father was the CEO of a small company where Jack also worked. Unfortunately, the company had been facing financial trouble for some time. Despite my father working late into the night to try and fix things, Jack didn't seem to care about the company's struggles. He showed little interest in helping, which made the situation even more difficult. With my father gone, the burden of both the company and the debt is heavy on me. I don't know what the future holds, but I am determined to keep moving forward and stay strong. Though my relationship with my mother and Jack is strained, I know I have the strength to handle whatever comes next, just as my father always believed I could. Jack decided to quit the company, saying, "I can't work for a company run by someone who looks so poor." He found another job, leaving behind the family business. My mother, who had stopped working since she got married, fully dedicated herself to managing the household. However, she had no experience running a business or helping with my father's company. Despite seeing his struggles every day, she didn't seem to understand or appreciate the challenges he faced. Instead, she often criticized him for the company's poor performance. One day, she said, "The company is still struggling. If you don't fix the debt soon, I won't be able to buy that new bag I saw in the magazine. What are you doing all day? You're completely useless." Her attitude was frustrating, especially since she had a habit of spending a lot of money on luxury items without thinking about the impact. She never seemed to value my father's hard work, and this made me feel angry and upset. Even though I'm not an expert in business, I had watched my father work tirelessly from a young age, and I understood how difficult it was to run a company. I couldn't understand why my mother, who had been with him for so many years, couldn't see that. She acted as if my father was incompetent, blaming him for the company's problems when she didn't even try to understand the pressure he was under. One day, I couldn't hold back anymore. I confronted my mother, telling her she needed to stop treating my father with such disrespect. Instead of listening to me, she looked down on me and said, "Why should I be lectured by someone like you? People without an education shouldn't speak on things they don't understand. Keep your opinions to yourself." Her words were hurtful, and Jack, who had always sided with her, joined in and criticized me as well. It became clear to me that, despite being part of the same family, we were very different in our values and personalities. My mother and Jack were focused on appearances and material things, while I had a deeper respect for my father's hard work and dedication. During this tough time, my father's support was what kept me going. He saw my efforts and knew that I took pride in my job as a nursery teacher. Cheryl, don't let their words get to you. Education doesn't define your worth. What matters is the good work you're doing as a teacher, he told me. His words filled me with warmth and gave me the strength to keep going. Even though I often felt overshadowed by Jack, my father's encouragement made me feel brave. As long as he was by my side, I believed I could handle anything. However, life took a turn I wasn't prepared for. An unexpected event shattered my world. My father passed away. I was horrified when I got the call saying my father had collapsed at work. The company staff told me he was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Without thinking twice, I rushed to the hospital. When I got there, I was shocked to see that neither my mother nor my brother Jack had arrived. Worried and confused, I called my mother, only to hear her say, "I'm too busy to leave. You'll have to take care of your father." I was stunned. How could she say she was too busy when my father's life was in danger? I couldn't understand what could possibly be more important than being at the hospital for him. As a housewife, surely she had more flexibility in her schedule than I did. In disbelief, I took care of the paperwork and formalities at the hospital while waiting to hear from the doctors. The news from the doctor was heartbreaking. My father had suffered from acute heart failure, and they said he only had a few days left. I visited him as much as I could, hoping and praying to see him smile again. A few days after his collapse, he briefly regained consciousness while I was holding his hand. I was so relieved and asked, "Dad, do you recognize me? Can you hear my voice?" But he looked at me with a distant, empty gaze before closing his eyes once more, this time for good. My father passed away, and neither my mother nor Jack made any effort to visit him in the hospital. They didn't come until right before the funeral, showing no interest in making any of the arrangements. As we talked during the funeral planning, it became clear that my father's company had gone bankrupt, leaving behind a $5 million debt. My mother, with a tone full of disgust, said, "Well, inheritances come with debts." As the funeral went on, both my mother and Jack began blaming my father for everything. "He was unreliable in life, and now he's left us with this mess," they complained. "What are we supposed to do about all this debt?" my mother wondered out loud. Then, with a smirk, Jack looked at me and said, "I have an idea. Since Dad was always so fond of you, why don't you inherit everything, including the debt? It's only fair that you repay the love he gave you." My mother quickly added, "Yes, that makes sense. You should take on the debt, too." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even after my father's death, my mother and Jack were more focused on their own selfish interests than mourning his loss. They were trying to dump the entire inheritance and the massive debt onto me, showing no care or responsibility. All my life, they had looked down on both my father and me, treating us as if we were only useful when it came to their needs. Even in this moment, their greed overshadowed everything else, leaving me feeling completely betrayed. I had a plan in mind, something my father had asked me to use if anything ever happened to him. Now was the time to put it into action. I decided to keep my true intentions to myself and, on the surface, agreed to my mother and Jack's demands. I pretended to go along with their plan while quietly preparing to execute my own. I said to them, "I understand. I'll take on the entire estate, including the debt." My willingness to accept such a massive burden surprised both my mother and Jack. They expected me to resist more, considering I was agreeing to handle a $5 million debt. But they were so happy to pass the responsibility to me that they didn't question my decision much. They looked at me with a mix of triumph and pity, as if they thought they had outsmarted me. Jack smirked and said, "So, you're really going to pay off all the debt? That's lucky for us. I don't understand why you do it, but you're quite naive. I guess that's what happens when you have such little education." My mother and Jack were eager to walk away, feeling they had gotten the better deal. They gave up their claims to my father's estate, and since there were no other relatives to contest the inheritance, I became the sole beneficiary. After my father's death, I moved out of the family home. I didn't want to live there anymore, surrounded by memories and the tension with my mother and Jack. I began a new chapter in my life, and it was then that I quietly set my father's plan into motion. Several months later, I had an unexpected visitor, Jack. I hadn't seen him in a while, but there he was, his face red with anger, looking like he was about to explode. His rage was sparked by the sight of me coming out of a beautiful, extravagant mansion. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. "How is Cheryl, who supposedly inherited $5 million in debt and has no social status, living in a place like this?" It was clear that both he and my mother had been wondering the same thing. They never expected to see me living in luxury after taking on such a huge debt. I smiled calmly and said, "Seeing your shocked faces is quite the reunion. I'm glad you're doing well." Jack wasn't amused. "Who do you think you are, making jokes? With no education. How did you end up living here?" "I want to know what's going on," he snapped. "This is where I live," I replied. "Is it really so surprising to see me at my own home?" Jack, growing more frustrated, moved toward me in anger. But he didn't realize that working as a nursery teacher had made me stronger than he thought. Lifting children every day had built up my strength, while Jack, who led a mostly lazy lifestyle, wasn't nearly as strong. I stood my ground, and for the first time, Jack realized that things were not as they seemed. Now it was my turn to surprise him. I quickly overpowered Jack and had him on the ground in no time. He looked completely confused as he lay there, and my mother rushed over to help him. I smiled and calmly began to explain everything. "The reason I'm living here is because of the choice both of you made to give up Dad's inheritance," I started. "Before he passed away, Dad had been quietly building wealth through real estate to secure our future. Even though his company had debt, the value of his properties went up a lot over time. After I inherited the estate, I sold the properties at the perfect time. Even after paying inheritance taxes, the profit from the sales was over $11 million. Jack and my mother were shocked, but I continued. Dad knew the value of the properties would rise, which is why I was willing to take on the inheritance, despite the $5 million debt. I paused for a moment to let that sink in before adding, instead of immediately using the money to pay off the debt, I made sure the employees of Dad's company were paid fairly. On top of that, I received a life insurance payout of $5 million. The shock on their faces deepened, and my mother interrupted, "Wait a minute, isn't life insurance usually paid out to the spouse?" "Normally, yes," I replied, but Dad changed the beneficiary to me. He told me about it while he was still alive. He was really hurt by your harsh words and your constant spending. He wanted to make sure the life insurance money was used wisely, so he trusted me to handle it. I looked at both of them and said, "I've had a dream for a long time, though I never told anyone. I want to support children who are struggling financially, and now, with the money from Dad's estate and the life insurance, I can make that dream come true." I then explained, "I used the funds to build this large house, which some might even call a mansion. I still work as a nursery teacher, but I'm also using the real estate skills I learned from Dad to grow my assets." As I finished explaining, my mother and Jack were furious. Their voices rose in anger. "This is ridiculous," Jack shouted. "Why didn't you tell us something this important? If we had known about the real estate, we never would have given it up." I simply smiled. "You were both so eager to get rid of the debt that you didn't take the time to see the full picture. You looked down on me and never expected I could handle something like this. But Dad believed in me, and now, thanks to him, I've made sure his legacy is used in a way that helps others." My mother and Jack stood there, speechless and angry, but there was nothing they could do. The choices they had made out of selfishness had led to this moment, and now they had to live with the consequences. I stood firm and replied, "Dad knew you would react this way, and that's why he kept everything a secret to stop you from trying to take it all. I didn't expect you to behave exactly as he predicted, but he was right." My mother was furious. "What are you talking about? We deserve our share of the inheritance. We have a right to it." Her demand shocked me. It was bold and selfish, but I wasn't surprised. Money has a way of revealing people's true character, and my mother and Jack were showing exactly who they were: arrogant and greedy, just as I had always known. "You both gave up that right when you renounced the inheritance," I calmly explained. "It's not possible to change your minds now. I can't give away what Dad worked so hard for to people who are only interested in themselves." Jack, frustrated and angry, shouted, "The uneducated one just keeps whining. Stop talking and hand it over now." Even though they continued to argue and demand the money, I knew I couldn't let them push me around. They were acting out of greed, and I had no choice but to ask security to remove them from my property. They left quietly after being escorted out, but their behavior didn't stop there. In the days that followed, security footage showed my mother and Jack hanging around my house, trying to figure out a way to get their hands on my father's inheritance. Their persistence was unsettling, and I knew I had to take action. Using the footage, I reported them to the police, labeling them as suspicious individuals. After that, I never saw them near my home again. A while later, I heard about my mother and Jack's situation through a family friend who had known us for years. Jack had found a new job, but his self-centered attitude quickly made him unpopular. Within a year, he had alienated his boss and coworkers, and he was reassigned to a desk job, a far cry from the special treatment he had once received as the son of the company president. Eventually, the stress of the work environment became too much for him, and he left the job. With his reputation tarnished, it became difficult for him to find a new job in the same industry. My mother, who had always praised and favored Jack, now turned on him. "Why aren't you working? Stop being lazy," she would constantly scold him. But it didn't change the fact that Jack was struggling to rebuild his career after ruining his chances. Meanwhile, I continued to live my life in peace, knowing that my father had trusted me with his legacy for a reason. While my mother and Jack had shown their true colors, I was able to honor my father's memory and his wishes by using his hard-earned wealth wisely. Their greed and selfishness only pushed them further away, while I moved forward, stronger and more determined than ever. Jack would often respond with excuses like, "I'm just sitting around doing nothing." Whenever my mother asked him why he wasn't working, she would lash out at him, saying, "What kind of effort are you putting in? You're useless and unemployed." After seeing Jack's failure to hold down a job, my mother's attitude toward him changed drastically. She once favored him, but now she blamed him for his lack of success and his joblessness. Her warmth turned cold, and she became distant, putting more and more pressure on him. The shift in my mother's behavior had a big impact on Jack. The constant criticism and coldness from her put a lot of mental strain on him, and he slowly became more withdrawn. Eventually, he stopped interacting with people and became a recluse, hiding from the world. Jack had always relied on our father's income and had never developed any real skills or the desire to work. Now, with my father gone, my mother and Jack both struggled financially. They were finding it hard to make ends meet without my father's support. As for me, my life took a much more positive turn. I am now happily married to the man I had been dating for a while, though I kept it a secret for so long. We live together in the large house that I own, which was part of the inheritance I received from my father. My husband shares my deep passion for helping children who are facing financial difficulties. Together, we are working toward making this dream a reality. We are setting up the necessary facilities and working to get all the required qualifications to support children in need. I feel incredibly grateful for the opportunities my father's hard work and planning have given me. His guidance and support were irreplaceable, and I carry his memory with me every day. With my husband by my side, I am living a life filled with purpose and fulfillment. We are not only building a strong and happy family, but we are also working to make a difference in the lives of others. While my mother and Jack continue to face their own struggles due to poor decisions and lack of responsibility, I am moving forward. I have turned the challenges life threw at me into motivation to build something meaningful. My father believed in me, and I am honoring his memory by using what he left behind in a way that brings good to others. Now, with a supportive partner and a clear sense of purpose, I am creating a future that not only benefits us, but also helps those who need it most. My father's legacy lives on through the work I do, and I feel fulfilled knowing that I am making a difference, one step at a time.